Hey, patrons, welcome back. Thank you again for all of the support. Of course, as always, I like to say that there's so much to cover and I don't have enough time, but I always want to try to give as much as I can to those of you supporting this work. It's so appreciated. I get a lot of hate mail these days, as you might imagine. A lot of people who don't like the fact that I'm trying to tell the truth about what's going on, irrespective of whether they want to play Daddy Putin or Daddy Zelensky or whatever it is. I mean, the truth is that we are living in a very complicated time when very few people really value trust and really put much value in objectivity. I mean, I understand that objectivity is sort of an illusory concept in and of itself, as Howard Zinn said, you can't be neutral on a moving train. But then again, hewing to reality rather than sort of the fictional version of it that a lot of people play out online, I think is very important. And I think that if you're listening to me and you're supporting this work, I'm assuming that you also value that. So thank you for that, and thank you for continuing to value truth. Okay, let's talk a little bit about some of the Russian military things that are going on here, because I just did a video that's available to the public on Turkey and on geopolitical issues. But I also think that it's important that we pay attention to what's going on inside of Russia, especially with regard to Russia's ability to continue to wage this war. So one aspect of this is the military industrial complex in Russia and the ability for that, complex, the various industries and companies within those industries to continue to fuel Russia's war machine and to continue to provide the material that it needs. So there was a story in the Jerusalem Post a few days ago about a letter that was leaked and published, and this letter came from the Trade Union of Civilian Personnel of the Armed Forces of the Russian Siberian region. And this letter was directly to the Russian Prime Minister Mishustin. And the letter complained both about low wages, ongoing low wages, and massive layoffs. Now, this is not the first time that we've seen a letter like this. In fact, there was another letter recently sent by the Archangelsk Trade Union to, I think, to one of the regional governors. Now, this is interesting because the trade unions, both that one I just mentioned and some of the other trade unions, they are a very critical block of support for Putin. They have been historically. Now, this again, when we talk about trade unions, we should be clear, these are pro-state trade unions. These are not militant trade unions that are really advocating for workers as much as they are sort of state sanctioned trade unions, similar to what you had during the Soviet period. Now, these trade unions, as I mentioned, they're an important aspect of the pro Putin voting bloc, but they're also, of course, tied directly to a lot of economic issues. These jobs drive a lot of these towns and cities where these factories and other facilities are located, and so it has wide-reaching ramifications, just as it does in the United States. But I think in Russia, this is even more pronounced as the economy continues to teeter on the brink, despite the best efforts of Russian propagandists to tell you, oh, everything's great, everything's wonderful, everything is just absolutely great here in Russia, no problem, we have the strongest economy in the world, just look at the ruble, right? I mean, you could see like the kind of insecurity that pro-Putin mouthpieces demonstrate when they talk in that way. But I digress. Let's take a look at some of the major sectors of the Russian military industrial complex, and I've already done a video on some of the or videos on some of these, but it's important to keep an eye on them because, again, as every week that goes by, things change. The main Russian shipbuilder known as Vostochnaya Verf stopped building ships, and they've stopped servicing and repairing ships that are already in service. Now, there's a number of reasons for this. The primary reasons being lack of funds and lack of parts. The parts, especially, is critical because the Russians depend on importation of a lot of these parts, and so because those parts cannot be imported due to sanctions, therefore production and servicing of these ships cannot continue. In fact, Vostochny Verf has had to cancel or the government actually canceled orders for two super tankers and two missile boats, both of which cannot be produced under the current conditions. This again tells us about just how dire the situation is for Russia's military production capacity. Similarly, Russian tank manufacturer known as Uralvagonzavod halted production. I did a whole segment on this in an earlier video. They halted production, I believe this was actually in March, due to lack of parts and lack of components. Again, the sanctions biting tremendously. Russia may be able to replace, French wine or some cheeses or whatever. I don't think it's going to be quite so easy for them to replace microprocessors, computer chips, and complex ship parts. Right? These things are not so easy to replace, and they're not something that can just be whipped up from scratch domestically. So this is proven by both anecdotal evidence, but also several studies that have been carried out on this. There's one that was highlighted for a study from the University of Zilina, which showed that the Russian defense industry has grown so dependent on foreign parts since the 1990s that it literally cannot function without these international imports. And just as one example, much of the electronic chips and microprocessors that are needed for some of these weapon systems, they come from Taiwan. Taiwan is not exporting these to Russia. How are they going to get them? It's not so simple. It's not like you can just make China an intermediary, given the fact that China is very worried about secondary sanctions from the United States and the European Union for helping Russia evade the sanctions. Remember back to a video I did several weeks ago about Chinese banks being unwilling to do business with Russian banks, primarily because the cost benefit doesn't really work for them. The potential risk of losing out on US business, on dollars, on international contracts, and so forth because of these sanctions is simply too great for whatever they might get out of buying up some of the Russian assets that are, to a large extent, pennies on the dollar at this point. Despite Russian propaganda, and if you follow Russia's propaganda, you see that they're very keen to make everybody internationally at least, believe that Russia's economy is weathering the storm nicely. It is not. Is Russia's defense industry is weathering the storm? It is not. They are collapsing. Now, the collapse is happening at a rate that, the Russian government hopes to be able to control. That's for sure. It's not an overnight collapse, but collapsing nonetheless. Yeah, according to that study that I just mentioned, in 2011, 2012, so about 10 years ago, dependence on foreign components was estimated at 80 to 85%. In other words, 15 to 20%, no more than 20% of Russia's components were produced internally, domestically. In other words, they are totally dependent on imports. I mean, there's only so many ways I can say that. The Russians would like to be able to do import substitution, but on some of these high value, high tech items, that's not so simple. Now, this is also translating into the propaganda space. Very interesting, the fact that Russian military bloggers, and when I say military bloggers, I mean pro Russian military bloggers, ones that are supportive of Putin, supportive of so called Operation Z, supportive of the invasion, the criminal invasion of Ukraine. They are very worried and they are blasting Russia's military online. And this is a very interesting development. They are really up in arms about about several things, but in particular this incident that happened a few days ago of a Russian motorized rifle brigade that was essentially obliterated as it tried to cross a pontoon bridge. The Russian military bloggers have just gone absolutely wild talking about this incident, about what it shows about the absolute incompetence of Russia's military leadership, including some of the generals and slightly lower ranking officers who, according to these bloggers and experts, have really learned nothing from the failures of the last 6 to 8 weeks. These bloggers are talking about how this shows a lack of tactical sense, that they're complaining also that Russia's propaganda is clouding their ability to accurately assess what's going on in the war. Very interesting. They're not really objecting to propaganda in itself. They're objecting to the fact that Putin's propaganda machine has been laying it on so thick it's become impossible for them to separate fact from fiction. Very interesting. These are widely read military bloggers who are very influential domestically in Russia. These are not people, who have no followings. These are people with significant followings who have, for the most part, been supportive of the aims of Putin and the Kremlin. And here they are openly criticizing what is happening. This, of course, is going to raise questions in the public mind about whether or not Russia's military can continue to sustain this war. It's interesting because we get this impression that in Russia there is just unanimity. I mean, aside from the anti-war protesters that we've seen from time to time, that there's basically, unanimity and support for Putin and a lack of interest in, what is really going on there. In fact, some of the most well-educated and well-informed bloggers are absolutely outraged about what's happening. So it's going to be interesting to watch how that plays out in the coming weeks and months. Is that going to ultimately impact everything? Is it going to impact public support for this war? Is it going to impact Putin's ability to continue to sell this war? We have to keep an eye on that. And of course, also the Russians' ability to continue to wage this war is directly related to their ability to continue to escalate. As the losses mount, escalation becomes ever more likely and ever more worrying. The real takeaway for me, and I mean, I know this is not something that's going to help people sleep at night, but the real takeaway for me is as the Russians are increasingly unable to produce tanks, to produce ships, to produce more of their conventional weapons, they are going to be forced potentially to rely on weapons of mass destruction. That raises the possibility of a nuclear exchange and all of the world changing implications of that. So I'm very worried. I'm very worried about escalation. I'm very worried about what it means if Russia can no longer prosecute this war in a conventional sense. So we have to keep an eye on that. I think I will leave it there for today. Again, patrons, thank you so much for the support. I will have more exclusive content for you in the coming days. Talk to you then.